మా భర్త అప్పుడు 13 సంవత్సరాల కింద పత్తి పెట్టిండు ఇట్లనే. పంట వెళ్ళక మందు కొట్టి ఇది పంట వెళ్తలేదు, అప్పు 1 లక్ష రూపాయలు అప్పు అయింది. అప్పు అయితే ఈ అప్పులకి ఏం కట్టాలి, ఇదంతా పురుగు మేసిపోయింది. ఎంత మందు కొట్టినా మస్తు తెచ్చుకుంటా కొట్టినా కానీ అది పురుగు కంట్రోల్ కాలేదు. ఇదంతా మేసిపోతుంది, ఈ పంట వండదు. ఇక అప్పులకి ఏం కట్టాలని వచ్చి చేనులోనే పురుగుల మందు తాగి ఇక్కడనే ఇక్కడనే.
That was a clip from a documentary produced by Action Aid, a global non-profit focused on human rights and poverty. Michael Kugelman focuses on South and Southeast Asia as a senior associate with the Wilson Center for International Scholars right here in Washington. He joins us from there right now. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, farmer suicides are not a uniquely Indian phenomenon. We know, of course, that it happens all over the world, including right here in the United States. But you have studied and written extensively about this issue in India. What makes it different in India?
Well, what really sets apart this very sad story from cases elsewhere in the world is that there have simply been so many of them and for such a long period of time. We're talking about the most conservative estimates, something like 300,000 farmer suicides in India over the last few decades, and that's extraordinary. And I really don't know of any other case, any other country where you've had that many cases. And again, I think that a lot of these farmer suicides are not recorded or not reported, so there could actually be more than those. So it's just the fact that there have been so many of them over such a large period of time. That's what really sticks out, and of course it's so tragic.
Right, and when we look at what's behind it, our two previous guests differed on that. The one guest saying that, well, look, it's actually health issues, it's mental illness, it's depression, it's things that are not being addressed. The other guest felt that it was more concerned with money, the fact that farmers are not getting enough money. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, as with all complicated issues, with all major policy challenges, there's no simple explanation, and I think that there are various factors at play. One certainly is the fact that many Indian farmers are indeed poor and indebted to the point that they become sufficiently desperate that they kill themselves. There are also issues that are much more different, like climate change effects, which has caused very severe weather patterns, including extended droughts, which make it difficult for Indian farmers to have successful harvests. So there's a combination of factors, and certainly health issues, you can't disregard that. Is that there's just not one single factor, and I think we'll never really understand what really drives these farmer suicides, other than the fact that you have really a perfect storm of factors, from climate change issues to indebtedness to the fact that you just have a lot of farmers that are not getting as much support, as much training, and as much help as they need to get through their very difficult plight.
And you've also written that politics plays a role in this crisis. How so?
Well, I mean, I would actually argue that farmers in India are not neglected by any means by the government. Farmers are regarded as a very important political constituency because there's so many of them. You've got something like 55% of Indian laborers are in agriculture. Agriculture is the key economic sector in India. So, in fact, over the years, the Indian government has provided a lot of support, financial support, loan programs, insurance programs. They've tried to be there to help Indian farmers, realizing that they're an important political constituency. And, there was an election in the state of Bihar in India a few months back. Bihar is a very large agricultural state and a very poor state, and the current government, the federal government, the BJP, did very poorly in that election, and I think it took from that the fact that it needs to do more to help farmers. So not too long after that election, the Indian central government released its new budget, and it was a budget that was very farmer-focused. So I think it's accurate to say that farmers in India are being forgotten and that their plight is being ignored by the authorities. It's not. But it's particularly because they're such a key political constituency. But the problem is so intense and complex that it'll take a lot more than throwing money at the problem, so to speak, to make things better.
And how does the media in India report this crisis? What kind of role do they play?
The media actually reports it very heavily. This story of farmer suicides in India, you hear very little about it in the Western press, and certainly not in the U.S. press, but it's actually reported very heavily in India, to the point that many have contended, many critics contend, that the media tends to sensationalize this issue and make too much of attention of it, that you actually get cases that of some farmers realizing that, or essentially realizing that things are really bad for farmers and even worse than they thought. What's the point of trying to make things better? Given what they're seeing on television and what they're hearing in the press, it makes them even more disconcerted, more depressed. And also people have complained that Indian media coverage tends to focus heavily on the compensation packages that are oftentimes provided to widows and families of farmers who kill themselves. And I'm not going to say I subscribe to this view, but there are some analysts out there that contend that sometimes there is an actual, grotesquely, sort of sad to say this, an economic interest for farmers to commit suicide, in that their families would receive economic support, economic compensation. Again, I don't know if I would go there, but the fact of the matter is the Indian media does cover the farmer suicide issue very heavily, to the point that some believe it could in some ways contribute to the problem.
And talking about what the government can do about this, the government has approved a $1.3 billion insurance plan for farmers, crop insurance. Those premiums will be discounted, but can farmers afford something like this?
Well, I mean, this is the thing, that there have been so many different schemes, so many different insurance schemes, supportive plans to try to assist farmers in India. But the bottom line is that the problem is so deep, and so many of these Indian farmers are so impoverished that they're not going to be able to, whatever they receive is oftentimes not enough, and a lot of times you have these expectations that they would pay a certain amount for loans, that it doesn't work for them. And one of the problems here is that you have a number of Indian farmers that are desperate for loans, and instead of going with the credible banks that will provide loans and that's it, they'll go for these cheaper intermediary, unofficial, informal type lenders. And these are the ones that tend to be very problematic, in that they oftentimes will try to force farmers to pay back their loans more quickly than they're supposed to. They'll threaten them to harm them. And some have argued that part of the farmer suicide epidemic is rooted in the fact that you have a lot of farmers that are essentially hounded to death by these disreputable lenders. So, and this all comes down to a financial issue. These farmers can't afford more expensive lending agencies, and so they're stuck going with these less credible ones.
Right. And on some of the solutions being proposed, one of the solutions is community farming. What exactly would that entail, and how would it work? Would it address the crisis?
Well, certainly. I mean, the idea behind community farming, and if you want to talk about it as something like organic farming, is that it's simply easier to do. It's less expensive. There are fewer inputs. You don't need as much stuff. You don't need as much technology. You don't need the pesticides and all that stuff. And the idea is that would bring costs down. So it certainly is a good idea. But the bottom line is that with community farming, organic farming, sometimes the yields are not as high, and it takes a longer time to achieve yields. And of course, a lot of these farmers, they need yields. They need to make money. They need to sell their crops off. And if they're focusing on these lower scale type methods of farming, it's not going to be a very useful situation for them. It wouldn't really resolve their financial problems. But it is good in theory. It's a good idea.
Thanks, Michael. That's Michael Kugelman talking to us from the Wilson Center.